on 95.3 FM in Windhoek, Desert Radio. The Bold Voice.
Is one thing, but one also needs to, move them forward and create a nexus between what happens, within unions or at the shop floor with what goes on politically. And that's why I became a politically active person now. Yeah.
And you've also been, very vocal about many other issues. One of those being about the situation in the fishing industry, right? Especially about the fishermen who were fired for an alleged illegal strike. But there is right now a perception that you somewhat left them hanging in the lurch. Can you perhaps just talk to us about what happened, what's going on in that situation?
Look, you see the strike of the fishermen. I don't think they had any other choice but to embark on that strike. And it had a lot to do with the fact that our Labor Act in its current form did not address some of the specific issues that the fishermen faced at sea, while at sea. The working hours, for instance, the payment of overtime, the formulas that the current Labor Act provides for would just not be applied as they are, to the fishing on the fishing grounds. So, and a number of things that I think the fishermen had to deal with for a number of years, and it reached boiling point, and they did what they thought was best. But as for the issues that might be seen to have been left hanging, look, after the strike came naturally, of course, the labor cases. I had represented the fishermen, Luderites, Wolfish Bay. Most of our cases, of course, we lost because the strike was illegal, as you earlier on noted. But also, we thought, we would mount a legal challenge on some of the aspects of the strike, which we thought, were justified, despite it having been illegal. So we went to court, and of course, again, also we lost. And then when the court issues were settled, there was really nothing more to do as far as those cases are concerned. What may need to be done, of course, is to look at ratification of certain ILO conventions that would speak to the specific areas of needs or of the fishermen or work at sea. And I think that's perhaps the next the responsibility of those who would be taking over and leading the workers, especially the fishermen. So we did what we could do humanly. Yeah, I mean, you don't always win it all.
Yeah.
You lose sometimes you win it all, sometimes you don't. Yeah.
And then, look, there's for the longest time always been a close relationship between unionism and politics, right? But sometimes when unionists leave for politics, they're somewhat known to, sell out for the struggles for workers and leave the workers behind to move on to the suit and onto the ties. Talk to us about your transition into politics now. Why did you decide to leave trade unionism and head into politics?
I think the reason is simple, and I think I hinted to it earlier on. You see, there's a need to carry the struggle of the workers, the shop floor struggle to the political, into the political realm. And then that's basically the reason why I thought, well, let's move this thing further. As for people betraying, the struggle and betraying the trust of the workers and so on as soon as they join political office, that could also be true. I've seen it. It's something I fought against. Even when I was with the NUNW, I was probably one of the most senior leaders fighting to revamp the affiliation agreement or accord between the NUNW and SWAPO so that it could give the workers, bigger voice. But again, the idea is that you see, this is almost like a revolution. It must be permanent. You see, if leaders take over political positions and become comfortable in those positions, then the ones that are right behind them should come in and take over and so on. Because people's interests are bound to change. We've seen this in bigger revolutions. And that's why Trotsky talks about a permanent revolution, that when you enter office, you are bound to have a situation where the leaders who were yesteryear's revolutionaries would acquire property, would become comfortable, would want to protect the system that gives them wealth, and therefore those who follow them should come in and take over, the revolution or the struggle forward, and so on. So it's a continuous a process. But in short, there are specific issues that are very similar in in nature that workers deal with or trade unions deal with, and that SWANU was created to deal with. SWANU was created to deal with, the small guy on the street, making sure that resources are equitably distributed, that there's fairness, there's justice at the workplace, and that there's justice and fairness in society. And I think these things they're no different from what unions, are meant, to do. So ideologically, there's that synchronicity, if you will, between both unions and SWANU as a political party. Whereas in SWAPO that I have been with, the situation is different. SWAPO is led by a heterogeneity of leaders who have interests that somewhat are not particularly coherent. But then those at the very top of it, who control the machinery, have the same interests as your typical capitalist out there, as your typical employer. Um, so the situation there was bound to be difficult for unions, unless unions gained strength, to neutralize the hegemony of those who own, property, or who are within the property owning class, or who are typically your capitalists. Um, if President Nyoma was the leader of SWAPO, and his vice president, for instance, would be President Pohamba, for instance, these are all leaders who have huge business interests, who have huge capital interests, uh, property interest, and so on. So they cannot reflect the needs, aspirations of people who are, left outside the economic, activity. So unless the union is strong and able to carry its voice through, only then would you be, able to neutralize. Otherwise, the hegemony of those who have, the levers of the power and who lean towards capital would just be too strong. Yeah.
And just echoing, on what you've said, and the stance that you've taken towards politicians in the past, right? You have at one point went on the record to say that they are disengaged with the reality on the ground, and you just reiterated those sentiments. So, with that in mind, and now that you yourself are wearing this political hat, why should Namibians trust you? Why should they believe and understand that you are not quite as disengaged as you say other politicians are?
Well, I think the fact that I come from the same background, the fact that I have the same political posture as the ordinary guy on the street, the same aspirations, I think those speak, for themselves. But you see, you cannot just simply also talk about these things without saying, but actually the actual test of the pudding is in its taste, So maybe at one point we need to get to that. But the record that exists on the basis of which one could, decide is that it favors me more than it favors any other ordinary politician. I would have chosen to be like everybody else, keep quiet, be appointed as a minister, a governor, whatever, and just move along. You understand? But I chose not to do that. I think there's more to life than just the temporary comfort that money brings. And we have a country to worry about. And if we don't stand up and reverse what has happened up until now and give our people a genuine chance or opportunity to a dignified life, then nobody would do it. It would all just be a waste. So I think, in short, that really is my response to that.
So you're not crossing over to politics to look for a safety net through parliamentary seats that come with, as people have said.
No,
Yeah.
no. Look, I think there's a lot. For SWANU, there's a lot to be done.
Mm.
As a party, SWANU has really been very dormant and politically or electorally.
Mm.
It has not had the best of fortunes. So there's a lot of work to be done in that sense. There's no time to waste sitting in parliament and receiving money and being comfortable. Complacency might come later. I guess that's just the nature of being human.
Mm.
But the tasks at hand are such that we need to get our sleeves rolled up and get our hands dirty and work. Yeah.
I actually want to engage a bit on that. So I'll ask you a question twofold. I mean, you did, sort of draw parallels between the trade union and SWANU, of course. So the first question being, talk to us a bit more in detail on why you chose SWANU specifically, in addition to the parallels that you drew. But also in relation to what you said now, I mean, you're right, the party has been dormant for a while. It has somewhat lost relevance, particularly amongst the youth. So what are the, sort of detailed actions you are going to take to make sure that SWANU gets to where you want to get it? But before you do that, I just have to remind the listeners that you are tuned into 95.3 FM. It is Desert Radio. Of course, this morning we are speaking to the newest president of SWANU, that is the Southwest African National Union, Evalistus Kaaronda, to just speak to us on his ascendancy as president of the party, and of course, what we can expect for him as the leader of SWANU. You have the floor.
Yes. No. Thank you. You see, one of the things that distinguishes SWANU from most political parties, if not all of them, is that we believe, for instance, let's take land as an example. We believe that land should be owned, controlled by the state, in trust for the people. That's what we believe in. We believe that the natural resources of the country must be controlled and owned by uh, the state for the people. Now, if the past 32 years haven't taught us anything, that the current arrangement of property ownership and property relations is wrong, then I guess we'll never learn, you know. So we're different in that sense. And we strongly think and do believe that if we continue as we do now, as we are, social inequality, economic inequality, poverty, all of these things will continue to grow. Um, we therefore believe that if all of us are to have a dignified shot at life, then there must be an equitable distribution of resources, of income, wealth. But the state must play a very active and central role in ensuring that nobody is left out. We don't believe in a situation where the state hands out food to citizens. We don't believe in that. It's a sign that the system has failed, it has collapsed, and cannot help itself, nor can it help citizens to get out of poverty. We also believe, for instance, that workers, apart from just earning a salary, should also become part owners of the companies for which they work. They must share in the profits. They must also share in the dividends. Something that clearly is not a policy position of most political parties out there, but something that trade unions would naturally find, favor with. It's a position that any trade union can take on and sustain. We also, for instance, do not believe that Namibia's prosperity or its industrial aspirations can be met um, by engaging the overseas men. You know, you don't want anybody from anywhere else in the world to come and help you uh, set your industrial agenda. You want to do that yourself. You want to invite people from the outside of the world to bring in their skills, to bring in their technologies, and help you drive your own industrial agenda. Now, SWANU believes that the current arrangement hasn't worked, it's not going to work, where we have one president after the other traveling the world, wasting our taxpayers' money, telling us that they are out there inviting foreign direct, investors. And every time they come back, I mean, go to your tapes, the NBC tapes, every time that President Bohamba would arrive back home, or President Nyoma, if now Hage, of course, they would tell you they had successful meetings with international investors and everything went well. But then uh, 3 years down the line, you see that nothing has happened. There are no investors. There's nobody driving our industrial agenda. And this is 20 what? 2030 is just around the corner. It's 8 years practically from now, maybe less than 8. So we haven't moved. So SWANU believes that there must be a change in policy. There must be a change in how we do things. And SWAPO is not capable of doing it. And that's why I feel SWANU is better in both in policy articulation, but also in the kinds of things that it thinks ought to be done to move forward.
Was this the same belief you had when you were in SWAPO?
It was, it was, but within SWAPO, as I said, I mean, the interests are so embedded, and those embedded interests do not speak to the interest of workers. People who call the shots, who have hegemony over the party, are those who are no different from the ones who must actually against whom we should fight, or we fight with, or we fought with at the workplace.
Before you go on,
Yes.
don't you think it would have been then wiser to speak and fight from within, as opposed to doing what you're doing now?
Not when debates are stifled.
Mm.
When the political space is stifled, you can't do that. You can't do that. You want to do it from the outside. The reason why SWAPO hasn't changed is not because people don't really want it to change, especially those who suffer the effects of workplace exploitation and social exclusion. They want to change it, but they just can't. The hegemony it rests with somebody else, the political hegemony of the party. So you can't do that. Now let's take a good example to drive a point home with the FDI debate. We had Ramatex. I'm not sure if you remember.
Yeah.
Mm.
Now, Ramatex, like any other investor, came, but we were so confused. We thought they came here because they had good hearts, I thought, it was a benevolent, act for them to come. But they were just hardcore business people. They came, they established themselves. The market would not or could not have been there if it was not through AGOA. Now, therefore, Namibia had the market. So we had off-takers already. Now, what we could have done, which in my view is always best, is to tell the Malaysians, we have the market, we'll provide the infrastructure, because we also gave the land anyway. I think 99 years lease or so. You put up the building according to whatever specifications there would be, and then you say, bring in your technology, bring in your expertise. You come in as partners with Namibians. You can take 30% shares in the project. We keep 70%. We finance it because we have the money to finance. And then you give them 5 to 10 years, within which they must show that they have trained Namibians, they've capacitated our people, and that once they leave, our people can take over these operations and continue to supply the American market. Now, we didn't do that. What we did is we left everything in the hands of the Malaysians, so they could do with the project anything they wanted. And as soon as they got tired of our nonsense, as they call it, they packed, they left. Now, they didn't just also leave overnight. We informed government that these guys are shipping out their technology, their machinery. They're going away. You need to block them. Nobody did anything. Malaysians left. Now, Ramatex is there. You see the building, big white elephant. Now, that's failed policy. And that is, if that does not explain to you why FDI in its current form will never work, then there's nothing else that will explain to you. And that's policy departure that SWANU is proposing, that instead of going out there looking for people to come and invest their money here, let's go out there, get people with skills that we need. But first, define exactly what kind of industrial activities we want. What are the priorities Namibia has industrially, right? Let's set those, let's agree on those, and then begin to work on those, invite skills. In any case, we are said to be a net capital exporter. So we make money and then we export the money. So if you export money, why would you go out in the world and look for money? Why don't you keep your money and just invite skills? You see? And I don't think there's any way in the world where people would industrialize relying on foreigners. China didn't do that. Malaysia didn't do it. Singapore did not do it. Germany didn't do it. So why does Namibia think it can go that route and succeed? It's just not possible.
Now, Evalistus, as we're talking about this, I want you to expand more on what SWANU's plans are. We've been talking about FDI, but I'm sure that there's more beyond that, and especially as national elections are a year away. What is your party putting on the table that makes you feel you can take, that victory from SWAPO?
I think, look, taking victory from SWAPO should be the easiest thing to do because SWAPO has poisoned itself. It has shown that it is unable to lead. So that shouldn't be a big thing. But there are policy areas. One of which, for instance, is land. Some call it land reform, but land nonetheless. Look, SWANU feels the basic problem with poverty, whether it's poverty because people don't have land or poverty because people don't have access to capital, is the constitution and the laws that are passed under it. If for instance, you look at rural Namibia, where we are told the majority of our citizens live or reside, and then ask yourself, can you ever put up your house in rural Namibia for collateral if you want to borrow money? Of course you can. Why? Because the rules by which the banks play their game are such that they don't allow you to do that. But a person who owns a property in rural Namibia but referred to as commercial farm can actually access a loan through the same banks. Now, what is the difference between a commercial farm and a rural, typically subsistence agricultural, house, other than the fact that the rules just say that you can't use the other one to access collateral, but you can use the commercial property to access collateral. Now that has kept a lot of our people outside the economic mainstream. Now, if the purpose, for instance, of introducing collateral or requiring collateral is to secure the money in the event that your project fails. Now, if that is the purpose, then there could be another solution that says, all right, yes, you live in rural Namibia, but we have faith in the project or business proposition that you're bringing to the table. We can give you money, but apart from money, we would give you an expert in managing that project. You can manage the project together with that person. The person in the process will also give you skills and make sure that your project is sustainable and that it succeeds. And that then reduces the need for collateral, especially for people in rural Namibia. Otherwise, the gap between those who have and those who don't have will continue to grow. Now, that to me is a fundamental departure, and that is what SWANU is bringing to the table as well. That let's focus on the potential that rural economy or Namibia has in addressing issues of inequality, in addressing poverty, in creating employment for our people. The next is your housing crisis, which we feel also was misdiagnosed. It is urbanized. We are told or made to believe that the problem or the crisis of housing is in urban settlements, and therefore government went out in a very urban biased way, put up houses in almost every other town. Now, we are told these houses are unoccupied. People didn't buy them. People don't live in them. They're expensive. But people come from rural areas to urban settlements, not so much because they want to, because they are forced by economic circumstances to do so. Now, if you come and put up a house in any town without creating employment, what is it that you want, that you are hoping these people will come and do in the houses? Come and do what? And how are they going to finance the houses? So why don't you create work where they live? because the rural economy has a lot of potential, much better and bigger than you would find in any urban settlement. Now, so you need to deal with the rural-urban migration crisis first. You need to deal with the employment crisis before you get to deal with housing, because housing is actually just a product or a function of whether you work or not. If you have a decent job, and government avails land, you can buy your house wherever you want to buy your house. You don't have to have government to build your house. What government needs to do is create employment, create industrial activity, and create better incentives for people to stay in rural Namibia, grow rural Namibia, and not bring or encourage people to come to towns just because you've built your houses there. You see. So again, it's a policy departure from the current policy, and that's what SWANU is bringing to the table. That we need to rearrange these things if at all we are to succeed.
With that in mind, what is SWANU's position on the resolutions of the previous most recent land conference? Are you in support of those resolutions? And I guess in twofold, does SWANU support the sort of willing buyer, willing seller model that we have for land within the country?
Look, SWANU supports a complete overhaul of the country's constitution. You see, if the constitution protects property rights, right? And we know this is what we were told just before independence, right? Now, if it protects property rights, but we also know that at independence, almost all black people didn't have properties. So whose properties was the constitution protecting at that time? It couldn't have been black people's properties, right? So it protected the properties of those who had property. These were white people, right? And then who joined them afterwards as property owners? Mostly, almost 99%, senior leaders within SWAPO. They acquired property, they bought farms, they bought houses all over the place, right? So their properties, again, are protected. What about you and I? How do we benefit from that clause? Unless you can acquire property. So we feel fundamentally we need to change the constitution so that it brings about fairness and justice. You cannot talk about equality without addressing the inequalities of the past. And you cannot ask those who benefited from the inequalities of the past to bring about that justice or fairness. You can't. They need to be forced. If we have seen over time that nobody would volunteer. They didn't volunteer, so they're not going to volunteer. So you need to change the constitution and make sure that it reflects the true aspirations of the black Namibians. Right now, it doesn't. It's a good Eurocentric constitution. And you see, maybe we tend to forget somewhat very easily. You see, our constitution is framed on the basis of the 1982 constitutional principles, which principles were presented to SWAPO as the sole and authentic representative of the Namibian people by Germany, by Britain, by France, by Canada, and the United States of America. Now, when that happened and when we accepted that, we knew exactly whose interest these countries were trying to protect. The Germans had to have friends. Germans were friends with the Americans, with the Canadians, and they aligned themselves with the British so as to push this thing, as well as the French. Now, the other interests that were also on the table were those of the South African whites, the racist South African whites, who had property interest here. Now, their property interests were then protected through those constitutional principles. And when SWAPO came here in 1989, it offered those and proposed a constitution. And the Constitutional Assembly then looked at those, they discussed this thing, and today we have a constitution which we are told is an exemplary constitution, is one of the best constitution, but best for whom? You see, if it's so best, why has it not done anything to enable our people to get out of poverty? The only thing that hasn't changed for the past 32 years, really, is the constitution. It has never changed. Everything else around us has changed. Poverty has increased, unemployment has increased, inequality has increased. So you cannot tackle those things without addressing the constitution first. You see, That's why it's called the fundamental law. If you don't deal with it, then the rest of the things that you do would not work. So that's the attitude that SWANU has towards the conference resolution. We don't believe in willing. There's nobody who's going to be a willing, seller.
But with that said, right, are there no fears that expropriation of land without compensation will cause chaos, as we've seen in other countries like Zimbabwe, where the economy collapsed when that started happening? Is there no fear that that will happen here as
But
well?
you see, the economy collapsed. I agree with you. I give you that, right? Look at our economy. What's the difference between a collapsed economy and the current state of our economic affairs in Namibia at the moment? Apart from the fact that you don't really see chaos all over the place. But the absence of such chaos doesn't mean that everything else is fine, So, and I don't see black people freeing themselves from poverty by being the first protectors of the current economic order, because it benefits white people. It was designed to do that. So if you want to get out of it, you first need to disengage yourself from the current economic order. And if you're afraid to do things outside of the box, because the experience we have with our neighboring countries and so on isn't particularly pleasant, then make peace with the fact that you'll be poor until you die. And the only thing your children can inherit from you is poverty. Now, I feel very confidently that if we are to make a difference, we need to change that constitution. If the person who came here to kill you, to dispossess you, take away everything you had, right? If that person is among the first people to join the chorus of saying your constitution is perfect, is the best in the world, then you must be worried. The reason why SWAPO is not worried about that is because they joined the thinking of that person. And a person who becomes a friend of your enemy must somewhat also raise questions, because that person can never be your friend as well. So SWAPO sold the revolution, they sold us out, and we feel that the constitution in its current form is unsustainable. We are postponing, you see, you are postponing the inevitable. There is bound to be crisis. President Hake the other day said, well, you see, we discovered oil. But technically, the well is not ours. Look, I understand what he means, right? But what kind of a president says that? We are so poor as a country. We want prosperity. But if the means through which we must gain that prosperity, or we must get to it, are not owned and controlled by us, then we would never get there. Because who is going to own everything? It is only those who have the money and those who are linked to political office, like Hage himself and his friends, whether Chinese or otherwise. So we won't get to it. So unless Namibians wake up and say, but there's something fundamentally wrong with our constitution, if it permits that kind of nonsense, then it's not a constitution we should favor, because it doesn't speak for us. It needs to be changed. That's the basic line, the bottom line. But over and above that, I feel also that Namibians must understand that if we don't push this thing, nobody will push it for us. No one. There are people who got killed. Imagine yourself. Why do you think Chris Hani was killed? It's so that the whites could maintain the status quo, can have their property. Why do you think they killed Chief Clemens Kapu in 1978? For the same reason. So why are we behaving as if white people are all of a sudden friendly and good? And when President Nyoma introduced national reconciliation, who did he really consult? Who wanted that? I don't think Namibians wanted national reconciliation, but we had to accept it because our leader had, brought it to the table. But what has it helped? How has that moved our people forward? It hasn't. How is it going to move our people forward? It won't, right? So unless we get to confront these demons of our past, but be courageous enough to confront them, we will never be able to get out of this situation. Now, SWANU proposes a departure from the current arrangement, one of which is fundamentally premised on the notion that the Constitution in its current form is unfriendly to every Namibian. It's unfriendly. It sells you a dream that would never materialize. It talks about equality, right? Everybody is equal before the law, but you've got to have money to taste equality.
As the party's new president right now, you are not in parliament,
Yes.
right? Dr. Tangeni Yambo still in parliament.
Yeah.
Do you think that you can promote the party's policies and ideas, like changing the constitution, if you are not in parliament?
Well, look, it's possible. I don't think it's impossible. Only if one was in parliament, it just increases or enhances one's chances. It creates better audience, I think. But it's possible, it's doable. But as for that, I mean, we still have room to decide on how we want to proceed on that. But yes, to answer your question, it's possible that it can be done. One person at a time, I'm sure, that you convert is better than having no one at all. But the parliamentary, presence would of course improve matters.
And then I see we're running just a bit out of time.
Yeah.
So as we move on to the 7 o'clock hour, pre-Congress, there was a lot of infighting happening within the party. There
True.
were factions that erupted within the SWANU party. Talk to us about what the status of that is right now. Are you still trying to sort of battle these infightings? And as a leader, what are you trying to do to plow the seeds of peace? And then, lastly, just within that, should infightings come up again, do you sort of have a mechanism in place already to deal with such issues?
In fact, there is a mechanism in place. There are disciplinary measures or mechanisms in place to deal with members who are deemed to be or conducting themselves in a way that is deviant from accepted behavior. But as for the faction, it's a faction, not faction. We dealt with the comrades. We had a congress. Now you expect, of course, um, political matters of a party to be discussed and settled at a congress. I mean, congress is the highest decision-making body.
100%.
Now, if you're not satisfied with what congress decided, tough luck. But that's just how life goes. The issues were there. The comrades remain on suspension, and I think by the end of the week they would have received their charges.
By the end of this week?
Yeah, by the end of this week
Okay.
they would have received their charges. They will be called in to a disciplinary hearing. They can bring any representative of their choice. And then we would have a fair and impartial chairperson to preside. And that's how that would be dealt with. That's what the constitution provides for.
But they're still members of the party.
They are still they were just suspended. They are
Okay.
members of the they are members of the party.
All right.
It's just some of their privileges and things were suspended because they are on suspension as members. But other than that, they remain members of the party. So as far our attitude is that Congress came, and Congress is something that it comes every 5 years. So everybody knew that Congress was going to come this year in April, and it did. So and Congress concluded its business, and it doesn't mean that everybody would be happy with how Congress dealt with matters or concluded its matters, but we are expected to accept the outcome of Congress and move forward. That's how democratic institutions function.
And then, lastly, just before we leave you, Mr. Kaaronda, I think a conversation that most, if not all, political parties have to respond to is the conversation around minority rights. As a political party, what's your position on supporting minority rights, and what is your view about the push for same-sex marriages?
Minority rights. You meant same-sex?
Yes.
Right.
The rights of the members of the LGBTQI
Yes.
plus community.
Look, we are a socialist organization or party. We fundamentally believe in the rights of individual, right, to decide what they want to do with their lives. It's a matter of right. Um, we cannot be seen to be opposed to that. The bedroom affairs of people remains matters reserved for their private lives. That's the general, I think, attitude of SWANU. Now, um, minority rights, we come from a history where we have always, respected or were forced by circumstance even to actually respect and appreciate rights of people, whether they were in a minority or not. So that's our history. We respect people's rights, minority or otherwise. The Constitution, in as far as that aspect is concerned, in my view, I think helps us, quite immensely. It says you shall not discriminate against anybody on the basis of sex, race, and those kinds of things. So that's where we stand as well.
So if there was a push or a motion for same-sex marriage to be legalized within the country, will SWANU be one of the first parties that puts up their hands and supports that particular motion?
SWANU would respect the rights of individuals as provided for in our constitution, and SWANU will always respect those rights. As for same-sex marriages specifically,
Mm.
that's a debate that needs to be had, as and when it comes, or as and when it happens. I don't see. I don't know. I've not heard SWANU having taken a particular policy stance on that. What I'm telling you now is basically informed by the broad principles of the SWANU's constitution, its history, as well as the constitution of the country, in as far as those issues are concerned. But that's a policy position that SWANU would have to discuss and take. But I can tell you that whatever policy position we will take would be informed largely by the principles of our own constitution and that of the country, specifically in regards to those issues.
Mr. Kaaronda, thank you so much for making time for us this morning. It's been a pleasure being in conversation with you.
Pleasure is all mine.